42 events around the 4 nations of the UK, focusing on all issues to do with pro bono. And we're delighted now to have an opportunity to discuss and debate the wider topic of the rule of law. In fact, this isn't quite the closing event, because following today's panel event, there will be some Zoom drinks at 6 o'clock, which you're welcome to join, and a link will be included in the chat. We have a fantastic panel today, and my role, beyond expressing my thanks, is to introduce today's chair, James Harper, who leads the Rule of Law and CSR programs at LexisNexis UK as the executive sponsor. LexisNexis have a long history of supporting the rule of law, and so very grateful for their collaboration in organising today's event. And thank you also to Augusta Ventures for kindly hosting this webinar. But I can't end there. There's one particular thanks I must give, and that is to Mary Dobson, who's been the project lead for Pro Bono Week, and it's been a tremendous success this year with her help. And thanks also to the National Pro Bono Centre for their support. So with that, can I hand over to James and our panel, and thank you to you all.
Thank you, Toby, and a very warm welcome to everyone who's joined. Before we begin, a quick note. We will be including a question and answer session at the end of our webinar today. To submit your questions to our panel, please go to the website Slido, that's sli.do, and use the hashtag PBWROL, that's Pro Bono Week Rule of Law. There will be a note in the chat to remind you of that. You can also use Slido to review questions that have been asked and to click on the thumbs up icon if you like them, and then we can try and answer the most popular questions at the end. This year alone, we have seen allegations and commentary against both the government and its advisors in relation to their compliance with the law. We've heard increasing rhetoric aimed at lawyers in relation to both immigration matters and the criminal justice system as a whole. We've witnessed a growing backlog of cases in the criminal courts, exacerbated but not caused by the COVID pandemic. We are in the midst of an inquiry on the future of judicial review, and we've seen a growing and belated focus on racial equality across society. These issues are not just a question of politics or current affairs. Each of them are rule of law issues, and they're just a selection from the past year. Indeed, there can be few times in our modern history where the rule of law has been more vividly at the forefront of public attention. With over 50 events across the country, as Toby said, it's clear from Pro Bono Week that lawyers feel the importance of the rule of law and the need for equality in our legal system, both deeply and personally. And yet, do we believe outside of the profession that the rule of law is either understood or appreciated by the public at large? And if not, how do we begin to change that? At LexisNexis, our central objective is to advance the rule of law around the world. So in order to frame our discussion this afternoon, I wanted to share with you our simple definition for the rule of law. It's made up of 4 principles. The first is that everyone is equal under the law. The law applies to you the same no matter who you are. The second is that everyone should have access to the law so that you know what it says, you can comply with it, and you can use it in your defense. The third is that the law should be administered by a judiciary that's independent, not subject to corruption or government oversight. And finally, everyone should have access to legal support, legal advice, and legal remedy. And the incredible work that's been celebrated throughout Pro Bono Week forms a huge part of that. Now, we sought to keep that definition as simple as we can so as to spread the knowledge of the rule of law as widely as possible and to persuade people that it applies to them and to their lives. For example, for businesses, we've shown that there's a link between a country's adherence to those principles and that country's GDP per capita. In other words, for businesses, they should get behind the rule of law because it's both the right thing to do and it's good for their pockets. The question remains, though, whether there is some way to go before the public feels the personal nature of the rule of law or appreciates its place as the foundation for all of their rights. To share a remark that was made at a recent panel on the promotion and defense of the rule of law, we would know the value of the rule of law, we would understand the value of the rule of law, we would need no persuasion about the value of the rule of law if we did not have it. Short of living in a time where the rule of law is wholly absent, and let's not fool ourselves, for many, many people across society, it genuinely is. How do we ensure people appreciate its value? Does the law need rebranding? Does the rule of law need a Marcus Rashford moment? Fortunately, I'm not here to answer that question. And even more fortunately, I could not have a more incredible panel to turn to for their opinions. Please join me in welcoming our panel today. Baroness Hale, former President of the Supreme Court. Baroness Helena Kennedy QC, Director of the IBA Human Rights Institute. David Green, President of the Law Society of England and Wales. Matthew Ryder QC, Barrister at Matrix Chambers and former Deputy Mayor of London. And Ian Anderson, Executive Chairman of Cicero Group and an expert in integrated communications, global political risk and public policy. And so let me hand over to our first panelist this afternoon, Lady Hale. And Lady Hale, I apologise, but to keep in theme with 2020, I'll have to ask you to come off mute.
Yes, sorry about that.
Not at all.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is great to be with you. And we've been asked, what are the greatest threats to the rule of law at present? Well, quite a few of them have already been mentioned, but I think that there are three particular ones especially relevant at this very moment. The first is that we are being bombarded with a huge quantity of laws, ever changing from day to day, from place to place, without any proper parliamentary scrutiny or control. And of course, one of the first things about the rule of law is that Parliament should be in control of what the laws are. The second is that those laws give draconian powers of enforcement to the police without proper scrutiny. And the third thing is that the whole way in which the package is presented to the public blurs the distinction between what is law and what is not law. And so those are the three biggest things that I think are the threats at the moment. But there are many, many more, and many that have been going on for much longer than those have. Thank you. Oh, you're mute now.
Show my respect by doing exactly the same thing. So thank you. Helena, may I turn to you? And likewise on mute.
Aren't we all being hopeless? It's wonderful to follow the great and glorious Lady Hale. And she's looked at very specifically the situation facing us with COVID. I'm going to go slightly wider than that. I want to talk about the fact that our world is at the moment facing two contagions, not just COVID, but also the contagion of populism. We're seeing the rise of populism around the world, and perhaps one of the grandest populist leaders is about to bite the dust today. I hope so sincerely. However, populism isn't just taking place in the United States. It's happening in many different places. And there's one thing that happens almost invariably when there is a populist leader, and that is that they usually don't like criticism. They, in order to satisfy the majority, because they are majoritarians, they believe in majoritarianism, and they've persuaded many people to vote for them on the basis of what they're going to deliver, and they rely on very simplistic ideas. And so when they talk about the rule of law, they tend to talk about law and order, and they don't talk about the much richer understanding of what the rule of law means. And in fact, you, James, spoke about it when we started, which is that it's about law that's available to everybody, that you have an independent judiciary, an independent legal profession, that you have who protect the judiciary, but also protect the law and are guardians of it, that nobody therefore should go unrepresented. There should be access to justice, that people should know what the law is. So as Lady Hale just said, we're seeing a blurring just now about what is law and what is really just something that it'd be better that you didn't do. And so the sense of law and it's the nature of it is becoming fudged. And one of the things that happens in populist governments is that they don't like critics, so therefore they tend to go after the media, the BBC, the Times, the New York Times newspaper, if you're Donald Trump, and CNN and so on, but also in its more extreme forms, as we see in places like the Philippines or in Hungary just now, an appropriation of the media. A crushing of journalists, and then they go after, almost invariably, the lawyers who represent those people who are thrown in jail, the opponents, and they go after the judges who make decent decisions. And so this is one of the problems, is that the judiciary almost invariably is attacked when you get the rise of authoritarianism and populist governments. They go after independent judges, they try to capture the judiciary, and they try to limit judicial independence. And so I feel that just now there are a whole set of threats to the rule of law. And unfortunately, you're right, James, when you say that we have a responsibility as lawyers and as judges to actually perhaps explain the purpose of the rule of law and its meaning in a much more successful way. And I'm sure Ian will have advice to us as to how that might be better done, because too many people think the law is simply that which is passed by Parliament or what the government says it is, and they don't have a sense that in fact law is a much richer thing than that in terms of what it does in stabilizing democracies, creating fair societies, protecting those who are most vulnerable. It can be both a source of oppression but also a source of liberation and protection for individuals. And so for me, the protection of the rule of law is fundamental. And one of the new things that I would say has to be spoken about, and it's why I would slightly disagree with your definition that you gave, James, at the beginning, is that a contemporary understanding of the rule of law has to mean and has to be imbued with the protection of human rights.
Thank you, Helena. David, your turn to try and come off mute and give your piece.
I'm reminded, good evening everyone, I'm reminded, James, whoever said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results has obviously never had to manage the mute and unmute button, the trouble we've had over the past few months. First of all thank you very much for inviting me this evening. I wish everyone good health at this time as we go into lockdown again. And thank you very much for those who personally organised, particularly Mary, this evening. And thank you to LexisNexis and indeed to Augusta Ventures, who are, I think, sponsoring this evening. The first thing I wanted to say was that there are many questions about the rule of law at the moment, but the one thing that we have day in, day out is a system that works and a system which the general population trust in delivering justice. And we must remember that whilst we're critical and we're concerned about all the things that we will talk about this evening, is that at the base we have a trusted system. I'm going to cover some specific instances of where I think the state of play is and challenges to the rule of law at the moment. The first, because I was dealing with it today, is in relation to the criminal justice process. We have, and we have been saying for a long time from the Law Society, that we have a criminal justice process that is in crisis. It is breaking down because we cannot now recruit solicitors into the defence, criminal justice defence. And I think the same is happening at the bar. We're seeing a fall off of practitioners. And I don't need to go into the reasons of it, but safe to say that we have a legal aid process, a legal aid system that is not properly funded for the purpose of a functioning criminal justice process. Second specific is that we've had criminal practitioners referred to, I think, recently as lefty lawyers. And to me, that rhetoric has severe dangers. It is, to me, if I may put it this way, dog whistle politics. I know that there's been much criticism of the Internal Markets Bill, but I put that to one side, because I think when political rhetoric starts lambasting those that are doing their job, lawyers who are doing their job day in, day out, in ensuring access to justice, in ensuring rule of law, then I think we're in dangerous country. And I think, as Helena has said, it is us, it is up to the Law Society, it is up to lawyers to speak up at this time and say that is unacceptable. We have to work with the government day in, day out, but we have to be a constructive critic when that type of language is used against lawyers, as I say, doing their day job. And I should say is that, of course, we do have some history in this, in that governments have often been critical of individual judges. We've seen, of course, we can recollect on David Blunkett's arguments with the judiciary in the early 2000s. So it's not isolated, but it is up to us to speak up and defend those that, as I say, are putting the rule of law, access to justice into effect day in, day out. And I think that this is, to my mind, having reputational damage across the world. And I'm only reminded, Helena was on a webinar the other week or the other day in relation to the Internal Markets Bill, and there were participants in that webinar from across the world looking at this jurisdiction in terms of the rule of law, because for whatever reason, we are revered as ensuring the rule of law. Our law and our courts are revered in that respect. We should remind ourselves that this is a position, I think, as Helena has been talking about, this is a position where the rule of law is under challenge not only here, but internationally. And there's a recent rule of law index, the 2020 rule of law index, has recorded an overall deterioration and stagnation across key categories. And it's important we are able to lead so that our reputation allows us to lead in relation to the rule of law. So I think that the other issue that we have to get across is we need to persuade politicians of the importance of the rule of law. And I know how we're going to do that is going to be the subject of our subsequent discussion.
Nicely segued. Thank you, David. Matthew, could I turn to you, please?
Hi, thank you very much. Well, I think if I was to answer this question, there are probably a few areas that I think we should cover, which I'm sure will develop in discussion. The first, I think, is what David touched on, which is the difficulty at the moment within what it was your fourth definition of the rule of law. In other words, access to a legal remedy. I think the destruction of legal aid and the way that people who previously would have had an ability to go to the courts and have good representation, the way it's been dismantled in the last few years or the last few decades is a horrible and tragic development of our legal system that any of us who've been working in it for a long time have watched with great anxiety. It is a fundamental part of British society, British democracy, British legal culture, which has disappeared. And when I was younger, I went to America and did a master's, or I went to law school at Columbia University in New York, and considered staying there and decided not to, because the way the legal system was set up in the UK and the way it was funded was so much more positive, such a much more fertile environment for a lawyer who wanted to do work for people who didn't have money and needed a remedy. And the legal system we're in now, in crime, in family law, and increasingly in public law, certainly in immigration, is unrecognizable from the legal system that I began working in the early 90s. So I think that for me is the most striking, most fundamental threat to the rule of law at the moment. The second thing that I think I would focus on is that at its heart, if you look through the way the rule of law is described in Tom Bingham's fantastic book, in Stephen Sedley's wonderful books, in all sorts of ways, what you're very conscious of is the very delicate, careful and well-constructed balance between the judiciary and the executive in helping our society to function. Those who take extreme views and think it's terrible that judges should be able to tell elected officials what to do, or it's terrible the other way around, don't understand that delicate balance and don't understand how well it can function. But increasingly, especially in the last few years, the last even 5 years or so, in this country, that delicate balance and the conventions, the unspoken rules that have been observed and understood by governments, by politicians, and by judges are under threat, because there are those who want to be in executive positions in government who are willing to trash those conventions and push forward any opportunity that they can to get a political aim through. And that, in my view, creates enormous difficulties for the legal system, enormous difficulties for judges, and enormous difficulties for that delicate balance if people are prepared to exploit the weaknesses or the fragility of it in order to pursue their own aims. Thirdly, a point Lady Hale touched on at the beginning in relation to very specific new legislation, but I think it's very apposite that such a senior judge would mention this as her first point, is the complexity of the law that we now have and the blizzard of legislation that has been coming through the courts that makes it hard to pick through the law. I certainly think that's very much the case, as Lady Hale was alluding to, in relation to recent legislation around COVID. But there are examples in Tom Bingham's book. There's a great example of a case that was argued before the Supreme Court, the House of Lords, only for them to realise before judgment that the legislation they were considering had already been repealed, and that nobody on either side had realised that they were dealing with legislation which was no longer in force until the very last minute. Now, if you're dealing with criminal law, sentencing, for example, as I sit as a recorder in the Crown Court, the complexity of sentencing has increased so dramatically in the last 10 years that David Ormerod's proposal in the Law Commission, or his work in the Law Commission to clarify, has been so needed for so long. So the complexity of law, I think, has made things difficult for judges and for lawyers. And the last thing I would say is increasingly there is a requirement. I think David's point is right about the general population, the way you put it, general population trusts the law. I think that's right. But I think there is a requirement and there is a need for the law to feel that it's more representative of the diversity and the width of our society. And I know we're going to talk about this in a bit more detail, but I would like to just point them out so that we can talk about them a bit further later on. There are a few cases that are particularly important to me. The case of Gillen that was argued before the House of Lords in 2006, the case of Radmacher and Grattino in which Lady Hale dissented, and the case of Somerset and Stewart. Those cases for me are really good examples, first of all, of how they illustrate a need for diversity within our legal system, but also to answer really James's first challenge to us. How do we have the Margaret Rashford moment? Well, Somerset and Stewart, for me, is the case which, in some ways, is emblematic of how representative and how revolutionary law can be. And unfortunately, we've not really capitalized on how that case should be part of our culture. And I'll leave you with this point on that. When I was Deputy Mayor of London, I had to deal with Windrush Day, which was 22nd of June, 1948, when people like my mother, who came here from Jamaica, came on the Windrush. Nobody seems to have ever realised that 22nd of June is also the day that Lord Mansfield gave judgment in the case of Somerset and Stewart, in which he said the black must go free, and in which a British judge decided that for the first time, trying to enforce rights over your slave was not something English law was prepared to do. They're the same day. Windrush Day and the judgment in Somerset and Stewart are the same day. And if we understood how our law has been at the forefront for the world and for our society in making that sort of change, I think it would be a better place, but we haven't capitalized on that as lawyers or as a wider culture and understood how important that law can be in that regard.
Thank you, Matthew. Ian, finally to you.
Thank you, James. And it's a tremendous privilege to be part of this conversation. I'm not a lawyer. I got close. I bested the current Lord Chancellor in the Inner Temple University debating competition back in the mid-80s. I won, but we have remained friends since. And actually on that point, listening to him on the question of lefty lawyers versus where the current Home Secretary and Attorney General are, I think, well, he does have his own positioning. We'll maybe get into that conversation. Also to your opening provocation, Lady Hale, about our liberties right now. Having created a business called and named after Marcus Tullius Cicero, he said, freedom is of an inestimable value, and where Matthew's just ended the conversation so far with an idea that people don't understand. I do think, and I'm very pleased to be part of this conversation because I often work with the legal sector. I do think there is a moment in public consciousness for the legal profession to now seize. Having seen freedom taken away, and it has quite severely been taken away during 2020, there's an opportunity to address the question of why. And what that means, and what we might do about it, and therefore to refresh. And again, in the second part of the conversation, we'll hopefully get into that. I was thinking about your 4 principles, James, that you shared with us earlier. And as the communications man, I'm going to do the thing that occasionally the chairs of parliamentary select committees do when they ask the witness to rank out of 10 the score on each. From my perspective, equality under the law. I think the public response to that might be, well, some are more equal than others. I might give that 6 out of 10. Transparency of the law. Well, we've just heard from Matthew. Do they understand? I'd probably give that 3 out of 10, and maybe we can get into that conversation about what is taking place in schools, what is taking place in terms of people's fundamental understanding of how law operates and what it's there to do. Independence of the judiciary. Well, Helena, you referred to that in the current populist context. The man who currently is in the White House is supposedly about to use some lawyers in order to make his case. He's going to politicize in the news agenda the use of law for political ends. Now, it's not in our system, but those headlines will, of course, wash over everyone for probably the next few weeks. And the drawing of political questions into the realm of the courts, and it raises the question of the independence of the judiciary. That has been there, that has been part of the debate. So I would give that number at the moment 4 or 5 out of 10 in terms of public perception. My world is perception. And then, yes, access to justice. What a perfect week to be posing that question when it looks like only Johnny Depp can actually properly pursue his ends. Now, of course, there are millions of other people that can pursue justice, but at that level, it only appears to be, as we've heard, the rich or famous or enabled who can properly, at all parts and places in the system, seek access to justice. So I think the best score, James, I gave of your 4 principles, which are great, is 6 out of 10. I'm really pleased that you're having this conversation because you care. I do think there is a moment to try and seize here. My final thought, I wrote a piece for the Times yesterday about something that that certainly I care about, which is the integrity of this country kind of going forward. And I never really bought into the idea of a written constitution. I think I now do. I think I now do because Britain, and not just the legal system, needs remaking and remodeling. But the context of the role of law and what law does, codifying, enhancing, explaining, understanding what law does, maybe there's actually a political moment for greater minds than I who are on this call to push into here with that idea. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ian. And thank you to each of the panel. There are a huge range there of challenges, threats, and issues that we face in the UK when it comes to the rule of law. And so I think even if we extended this webinar by many hours, we wouldn't address all of them. But let's start towards the end with some of the comments that Ian made. And Lady Hale, I'm going to come back to you. Ian threw out a challenge that there is a moment here to be seized. And thinking about some of the 3 points that you put across, how do we begin to do that? Is it a case of clarification of where powers begin and end? Or is there a bigger challenge that needs to be overcome first in terms of the public's appreciation for why that is important?
That's very difficult, isn't it? I had been hoping that there was a moment to be seized because eventually the general population would wake up to what is happening at the moment, to their taken for granted freedoms, to what they can do in their private lives, to the power to express themselves, to get together, to have demonstrations and so on. And that realizing that how far this has gone, they might begin to question whether it should have gone this far and what can be done to challenge it. That I would have hoped. So I really do hope there is a moment to be seized here. Thinking about what everybody has said, the 2 things that come over to me most strongly, the first is the need for people who aren't lawyers to get it. Now, lawyers do get it, but we are always accused of being self-serving if we put the case for legal aid, if we put the case for proper legal processes, if you put the case for proper scrutiny of government action and so on. We are accused of serving our own interests, as well as, if not more than, the interests of clients and justice. So we have to get people who aren't lawyers to understand what it's all about and to speak up for it. And that has been very beneficial at other times in our history. And I think related to that, something that I would really, really love to see is education is a rather grand word, but what I think education is what I mean I would like people in schools to begin to learn what the legal system, the justice system is for and what the law is all about. It should be compulsory for school students, including primary school students, to know those basics of our constitution and what the law is all about. And I know it can be done because there are ways in which these ideas are introduced to even very young pupils. So those are the two things that I would try and do, for the lawyers to seize the moment to persuade the non-lawyers that there's something here they've got to get their hands into, and to try and get these ideas into schools as well. Thank you. That's enough from me for the time being.
Thank you, Lady Hale. Helena, can I turn to you on that point? You were talking in your piece earlier on about popularism and the power of popularism. One of the comments that David made was that we all need to stand up and say that what is happening in certain circumstances is not acceptable. Mm-hmm. And I think as a profession and as various different professional bodies, we do that. Mm-hmm. And yet it never seems to cut through the noise of popularism, of the rhetoric, of the prevailing narrative that then takes over and drowns that out. Would you agree? And how do we therefore start to change the tone? Are we in fact doing the wrong things? We talked earlier on jokingly about repeatedly not coming off mute as being the repetition of something that we can't get used to doing. We repeatedly say it's unacceptable to talk about lawyers like this. It's unacceptable to breach the rule of law. And yet we don't seem to change the narrative.
You see, it always seems to me that where this always gets tricky is that if you have the general idea of what is law for, you know, our society needs rules. Any society, we need to have some rules by which we live with each other. It's the nature of things. People recognize that. I remember when one of my children was little, mums and dads were being asked to go into the school to talk about what they did. And so on some occasion, they got me to go in, and I brought a wig and gown. And I said, they were all about 8 or 9. And it's very easy to say to kids, what does it mean if something's not fair? And they say, well, you know, if Charlie ate my sweets, or if Charlie took my book and didn't give it back to me and so on, it's not fair. Or if the teacher always picks Charlie, then that's not fair. They know what fairness means. And it's the way of ending up talking about why you need to have people who can decide whether something's been fair or not. And so you have no difficulty in talking about some of these concepts with children from quite an early age, because they learn very early on when something's not fair. I think that people can be very easily galvanized into feeling hostility towards lawyers by those in politics, when the lawyers are representing people who are considered somehow unworthy. And so if you're a criminal lawyer representing defendants, then of course, why would you choose to do that? Why wouldn't you be choosing to be a commercial lawyer? It must be that you're somehow a lefty who encourages criminality or some notion. I don't know what people have in mind when they're saying that. When we know that the idea of being a professional involves representing people, and you do not adopt and cannot be seen to be a persona of your client's interests. You know, you're doing it because you're a professional who's making sure that a person is well represented before the courts in the way that they would represent themselves if they were able to do so and were knowledgeable in the law. That's part of being a professional. And somehow what is happening just now, it's not that the people who are saying these things don't know what they're doing, but you basically create a hostility towards the people who are looking after immigrants, because immigration is one of those flashpoints, who are looking after people who are charged with terrorism, because terrorism is one of those flashpoints. And so there's an ugly thing that happens when you have a government prepared to do that. And governments of all shades have done it. You know, this business of talking about fat cat lawyers as though people who were defending in the criminal courts, doing very difficult cases where people's lives, you know, that long parts of their lives might have involved imprisonment, they were being if they were being paid out of legal aid, they were being presented as being fat cats. And the people who were saying it were themselves the fattest cats of all. So, you know, we've got to be very mindful of how this is used, this rhetoric. And it's so hard to get over why law really matters to people's lives. But by God, people know it as soon as they themselves or somebody in their family or they are presented with a problem where they need good lawyering. So I don't know what the answer is to ask Ian, as somebody who knows that world of public relations, about how do you get people to recognize if it's not that they're leaders in their society, they're politicians, they're those who are in the public space, aren't saying this is important because it could be you tomorrow. It could be us. It could be somebody who belongs to us. If you've not got your people who control the public space saying those things, then it's very, very difficult for us. And as Lady Hale says, you know, because we're seen as being self-serving. Self-serving. You just think about what the young people in my chambers are earning just now if they do criminal cases, or my daughter-in-law who's a solicitor in a high street law firm. They are earning nothing. They're not even being treated as professionals. And what we're seeing is the deprofessionalizing of our profession, or certainly whole tracts of our profession, and that should be a source of shame. But the attacks on the judiciary are another part of this. And yet around the world, Britain is looked to as being this great purveyor of law, of justice, of standing for things that they want to emulate. And there's somebody in the side bar asking a question of, why is it that law is being created without proper processes and so on, and is rather shocked at what Lady Hale has described. And I suspect that person is not from here in the United Kingdom, from how the question is posed, because people are shocked when they find out that these things are happening here, because we were always looked to as being the great place for this. And that's one of the things that we should remind our people about, is that this is one of the great riches that we have, and that we have to protect it.
Ian, there was a challenge directly in there for you from Helena, so I'm going to jump straight to you on that.
Yeah,
which is, how do we start changing that tone?
Yeah, so it seems a strange thing to say to a bunch of lawyers, but you've got to make the case. And I want to go back to what Lady Hale said. I mean, one of the best things, one of the most enriching things I do beyond the day job is, and some of you may have come across this initiative created by Robert Peston. It's called Speakers for Schools. Some of you might have come across it. Helena's nodding. Yeah. And it's genuinely one of the best things I do. I walk in there in my suit and explain to them my journey. You know, there I am as a young kid, didn't even know this job existed. And now I tell them about what I do. Now, I'm sure there are plenty of people on this call that do similar things, but really getting people to understand. I want to go back to Matthew's expression earlier, which I wrote down. People don't understand. Well, they're not going to understand unless you make the case. They're certainly not going to understand if the case is being intermediated by the Daily Express or the Daily Mail. Yeah, you've got to make the case resonate. You've got to explain what the profession is there to do. All the attributes that sound a bit lofty, you've got to make them real. So how do I do that in my world? You paint a picture. You tell real life stories of real experiences of people who've been helped by law, who've built a career in the law, who make an economic contribution because of everything that the law allows people to do. There's the ability to trade, the ability to have a job, the ability to have a secure job, all those sorts of things. So yeah, I think it's starting early. But the other thing is that I think more people in the profession need to kind of climb out of the comfortable zone of being in the Times legal pages and frankly enjoying battle. And I come back to the point about where we are right now. Digital and digital communications, particularly in our politics, is sort of making some of these debates more and more difficult. They're getting more immediate and they're getting harder to kind of to fight. So what is the laws? What is the legal profession's approach to how to rebut some of this digitally, but also to try and take the debate on, to enjoin the debate, to actually ensure that there's a conversation taking place here, rather than the shouting match that's taking place at the minute? I think an awful lot of people duck away. I think a lot of lawyers, quite candidly, are very comfortable on their own postage stamp of issues, but don't want to, with the notable exceptions of the people who are on this call, they don't actually want to talk about that wider economic and societal contribution, and they need to.
David, that feels like a good moment to bring you in from the perspective of the Law Society, representing at least a sector or a large sector of the profession. Do lawyers have to start doing things differently in the way in which they act, or in the way in which the profession is represented, in order to cut through, in order to make people understand, in order to make the case, as Ian puts it?
Well, can I just pick up in dealing with that? I think Helena was talking about the populist message, and we're certainly seeing that increasing around the world. I think we've talked about Hungary and Poland, and of course the populist message differentiates lawyers and the legal system from the people, because a populist politician says, I am here to represent you, the people, and these people, these lawyers and the law is in some way standing in the way of my representation of you. And we see that across the world, and we see it in the United States as well. Now, I think that we ourselves have a problem there, because I'm not sure that judges nor lawyers actually reflect the society for which they act. I take, for example, we can see the clash there. When a judgment is made by a judge that a politician doesn't like, and that gets into the media, the judge is always pictured sitting in robes and a wig. And that is intended to differentiate that person, that judge, from the people. We have to address that by increased diversity and inclusion, both within our own profession, but also within the judiciary. And I think that is something certainly we at the Law Society are working on, and I know the Judicial Appointments Commission is. Second point is, as Ian says, lawyers are not necessarily the best people to argue in relation to popularize the rule of law. The very phrase, the rule of law, means something to lawyers. But how do you translate that into everyday life for the ordinary citizen who's dealing with a housing problem, who's dealing with being accused of a crime, who's dealing with family matters, a divorce? How do you translate the concepts of the rule of law to popularize and say, this has real meaning to your everyday life? And I think that's something that perhaps lawyers are not best at, because we need to change our language. We've now got a review of the independent review of judicial review. Well, judicial review, to me, to everyone here, and I'm sure to most people listening, has a meaning to us. We know what it means, but how do you translate the importance of judicial review to the ordinary person in the street who may come to rely upon it at some point? And I think that we need lessons, and I look to Ian to some extent, is we need lessons in how to communicate that. I was just thinking, I'm trying to communicate, I was talking to someone earlier today about communicating judicial review, for instance, or communicating the role of the judge. Is it like not having a referee in a football game? Is it not like having a referee in a hockey game? You know, what would flow from that? Is that the way to translate it? And I think has been said earlier, is we need to translate it from the beginning in schools as to what it actually means. And I think that's the task we have. And I think this is an opportunity, actually, because I don't think I've seen, and certainly since the early 2000s, we can think of the incidences when David Blunkett was Home Secretary, but I don't think I've seen the rule of law being debated so vigorously in public for very many years. And I think we do have an opportunity now, and we have to grab it and run with it. And the other, I want to make a final point is, when we talk to politicians, there are issues about legal aid, for instance, but we have to tell them about the economic value of the rule of law. It is so vital to a functioning economy that we have a reputation that stands throughout the world. And I think we need to make the economic argument about the necessity for a strong rule of law.
Can I just come in? You know, I agree with that, but I don't want us to only make the argument for the rule of law on the basis that commercial outfits around the world look at the city and say, and it happens all the time. There are big contracts and they're between companies that are not even based in Britain. An American, a huge pension fund in Sweden, and invest with some company in the United States. And where do they have in their contract that the thing will be resolved? In the British courts. Why? Because the caliber of our judges at the high level, their independence, their incorruptibility, and so on, is recognized everywhere. But I don't want that to be the only reason why we do things on the financial basis, because I mean, I think actually having a society that trusts its judges, and I think that by and large there was a time, I mean, until very recently, were very trusted. Judges are up at the top, and probably still are, of the trusted professionals in our midst. But it made me laugh. In the whole business of debating Europe, and we're not going to debate Europe tonight, now belonging to Europe, not belonging to Europe, but one of the things that was used was, we don't want to be going to international courts and having these foreign judges making decisions about us. We want it to be in our courts, our judges, our terrific legal system. And then as soon as our terrific legal system is dealing with matters, then suddenly they're attacking our judges. And you have to ask yourself, is it sovereignty that they care about, or is it actually that they don't like a rules-based order? And that's one of the things, is that I gave a lecture recently, and I'm just going to mention this for everybody to take home with them. I gave a lecture recently on the rule of law. And in fact, there was a very distinguished psychiatrist, was one of the people who was interlocutor with me. And he said, what you've described in the way in which these authoritarian leaders around the world, because I'm working now so internationally, around the world, what they're doing, he said it's about not liking law, not liking independent judges and so on, but also not liking the rules-based order, the international order, which was created after the Second World War, and the horrors of that, and wanting to create a multilateral system which said when countries are doing bad things, there ought to be ways in which things can be taken to international courts, because your own courts may be captured. The Nuremberg trials of judges were because the judiciary was captured. So we've created a different sort of setup. And the point about all of that is that you need to actually have a rules-based order. And the psychiatrist said to me, These guys who don't want regulations, they don't want rules-based things, they are adolescents. They are stuck in their adolescence. That's who become populist leaders, people who don't like rules. And so I'm afraid that I'm going to say to you, look around you. Does that look like anybody that we might know? Any of the people that we've seen recently leading countries? The sort of juvenilia of it, the infantilism of it, the nature of the people who are doing this. And I think that he was onto something. The fact that there's a maturity in recognizing that you do need law. Sometimes law can do bad things in people's lives, and that has to be challenged. But that also law can be vitally important in maintaining stability in a society in a good way, especially if you protect people who are vulnerable. And so the thing to do, and Ian will tell you this, is to tell stories about law, is to tell stories about how judicial review works for people, how when people have suffered the consequences of being bullied in the army, women who committed suicide because of the way she was experienced harassment and bullying and sexual harassment, how she took her own life, and getting an inquiry which her family had to go for judicial review to secure was about exposing something that was so appalling within our armed forces. You need to be able to challenge authority, and judicial review gives us the power to do that, and that those who've got authority are trying to limit it. And so we should warn people about what that means.
Thank you, Helena. Matthew, can I come to you? During your time as Deputy Mayor for Social Integration, you will have spent probably more time than most of the rest of us on that border between dealing with politics and the law and dealing with people who are in society and are therefore somewhat disconnected, and kind of the audience that we're talking about wanting to reach out to. To some of the comments and suggestions that have been made by the panel so far, do you think that chimes or would chime with people? Does it start to change the narrative? Does it start to make the case, again, as Ian said earlier on, for respecting and protecting and wanting to hold the rule of law dear?
Yes and no. I think that the suggestion that we tell stories and we try and show by evidence what makes lawyers and the legal system so valuable is a means of doing it, but it is not the way to do it. And as lawyers, it's very difficult to have to come to terms with the fact that winning an argument on evidence for the public is not the way to achieve what you are talking about tonight. The lesson I learned when I went to work in politics is that all politics is identity politics. Now, I don't mean that in the usual sense we use the word identity politics, meaning politics about who you are or your race. I don't mean it like that. I mean it's identity politics in the sense that people latch on to ideas if they feel it chimes with their identity, if they feel it's who they are and how they feel. Most ordinary people don't have the time or space in their lives to sort through arguments about why something is good or why something is bad. What they're interested in is trying to understand, is this something that is part of who I am or not? Do I identify with this? Do I feel this is part of who I am or not? For me, one of the best examples of this is the way Americans love their Constitution. It's not because there's some amazing argument that's been won about why a constitution is good. It's because they feel it's who they are. It's what they love about their culture and their society. In exactly the same way, until the 80s, there was an open debate about whether the NHS was a good or a bad thing. There's no longer that debate. We don't have that debate. For every British person, the NHS is who we are. It's part of our identity. Even if you're a Tory on the right side of the party, you can't go publicly and say I'm against the NHS because you're going against British identity. And one of the things that's most upsetting for me is that the post-war changes that happened, free education, free housing, free healthcare, free legal services, have not been elevated and respected in the same way as we've moved forward in society. And so while we continue to love and respect and adore and feel as part of our identity, the NHS, somehow along the way, politicians, and I hate to say this, but Labour politicians as well as Conservative politicians, allowed our legal services to somehow be pulled aside as if it wasn't part of that amazing sense of British identity that happened after World War II. Free legal services is who we are, as much as free medical services is who we are, as much as free education is who we are. And somehow we stopped talking about legal services as part of our identity as a culture and society. So for me, of course the arguments are right, of course give examples, but what we need to do is go back to trying to understand and trying to explain to people that the stories aren't just about the merits of having good legal services. They're about who we are as a culture and as a society and what made us so special. You know, we're not, sorry to go back to some of the things I was talking about at the beginning, but when you read, for example, I was talking about the Somerset case, and anybody listening, and that's the case in which Lord Mansfield in 1772 refused to allow a slave owner to exert rights over his slave, to take him back to Jamaica and exert rights over him when the person was in the UK. It didn't abolish slavery as a concept, but it said you cannot exert rights over your slave in the UK. Now, David Olusoga, the historian, talks about that in his book. And if I can, I just want to read you a line where it says, "It was reported in the newspapers that on hearing those last words," and the words were "the black must be discharged," that was the judge's words in 1772, "the black must be discharged." It's reported in the newspapers, and on hearing those last words, the black people in the crowd, yes, black people were in the crowd in 1772, the black people in the crowd, quote, "bowed with profound respect to the judges and shaking each other by the hand, congratulated themselves upon their recovery of the rights of human nature and their happy lot that had permitted them to breathe the free air of England." Now, I, as a black person, never learned that story. I didn't learn it growing up. I didn't learn it in law school. I never was taught it. I didn't learn about that case. But had I learned it, it would have said to me, beyond government, beyond the rules, there is something about the law that told someone like me, you're going to be respected. Your rights can be safe. Judges will push back against the state in order to protect all of us. And I think that wonderful thing that we all love about the law as lawyers and as judges is something that's not been told as a story as part of our culture and our identity. So if you're asking me, how do we do it? My long-winded answer is make it part of our identity and make it part of who we are again, because it once was back in the 1940s and before.
But that's about telling a story, Matthew. It's telling a story. Because you can't reach to who people are and make it feel real for people unless you add that kind of sense that of that story, which has been absent for so many, you know, for most of us until comparatively recently. That story isn't well known and isn't told about what law does and why it's so important and what it can do for all of us. I just want to say one other thing, which is that if you are going to think about having a constitution or something of that, so I mean, I used to chair Charter 88, and I believed very strongly in having a written constitution. And the reason I retreated from it in more recent times was because I just don't know how you could possibly now get it through a parliament. We're talking about, I just think it would be so impossible to make the parliamentary time in a complex society in order to do that and to get the kind of, what usually happens in constitutions is they have that belief that people give it because it comes out of a period of a war or a conflict of some kind, of some rupture of some horrifying kind. And thank God we aren't quite there yet.
Aren't we, Helena? Aren't
Sorry?
we? Isn't 2020 creating, sorry to cut in there, but isn't it creating a rupture? Sort of going back to what Lady Hale was talking about up front, isn't it creating a rupture?
Well, I mean, I think that the problem you would have is that at the moment we're looking at the breaking up of the United Kingdom if we're not very careful. And I don't think that if we tried to create a constitution at this moment, there'd be lots of different people who would have a very different conception of what they think that constitution should say. So I think we would spend the next couple of decades
let's be careful not to get too stuck into that one specific topic around a constitution. Yes, Matthew.
Sorry, what I wanted to say in addition was that in order to feel like the law and judges are part of our culture, it goes to something David was saying, which I really agree with. People have to feel that the law is for them, and the people have to feel that the law reflects who they are as well. One of the most amazing things in a positive way about the Supreme Court, when it started doing its work, is that it's one of the most accessible courts in the world. You can watch it on YouTube, you can see the judgments as soon as they come out. It's wonderful. You can go into the building and see what it's like. It's one of the most amazing things about making law accessible to people. But if you look at sometimes how our law is described, how our law feels, I'd like to make a little point about the case of Gillen that I mentioned at the beginning, 2006 House of Lords case. And that was a case in which it was looking at powers that could be used, police powers, to search people and stop people in relation to terrorism. And they were powers that could be used fairly arbitrarily. Now, the reason this case is special to me is not because of the precedent it created, but because it's the only case I know that I'm aware of where the entire one side of the argument was represented by three lawyers who weren't white: Rabinder Singh, Rajiv Menon, Gareth Wong. And they walked into the House of Lords to tell the judges, Tom Bingham, Lord Hope, Lord Scott, Lord Walker, Lord Brown, that why this particular provision was wrong. And as part of the argument, Lord Justice Singh, as he now is, advanced the fact that there was a racial dimension to this provision that they were overlooking, and that had an important element to it. And all of the judges said, thanks, Mr. Singh, we don't agree with you on that one. And these three non-white barristers representing or putting this case forward were told by the judges, which is totally fair enough, we hear what you say, but we don't see this racial dimension to the argument that you're running. Of course, Strasbourg did, and the case was decided the other way in Strasbourg. But that element of it, I think I'm probably the only person who follows and was interested in it. But it reminded me a lot of Radmacher and Grantino 4 years later. And I don't want to embarrass Lady Hell because she's sitting here. When Lady Hell dissented in that judgment about prenuptial agreements, was the only woman on the court when she did so, explaining in her judgment an element of that. And I don't want to embarrass Lady Hell, but when I read it, I just said I wrote about it at the time. When I read it, for me, it said, I'm not sure that this room full of people fully understands the issues that are in play here. And I'm bringing my perspective to this argument, but I'm not sure everybody else fully sees it in exactly the same way that I do. Now, not criticizing anybody on the court in either of those cases, the fact that you can have a voice in the court as counsel in Gillen or as one of the judges in Radmacher is so important to say, here's the perspective that we're bringing in. If people are to feel invested in the Supreme Court and invested in those judgments, to see people like themselves reflected back at them, whether it's women, whether it's people of color, as the judges or the counsel, is a vital part of people feeling engaged in our system and feeling it's part of who they are and what they want to see.
Can I come to you then, Lady Hale, on that point? And just to touch on briefly, I'm conscious of time. We have about 20 minutes left, and I do want to try and fit some of the audience Q&A in as well. But just to talk about whether the diversity across the judiciary or the lack thereof plays a fundamental role in overcoming this challenge or in causing this challenge that we're talking about people not feeling the rule of law at the heart of their identity. And sorry, you're on mute.
Yeah, it must be part of it. I agree with Matthew that we have reached a point in which people shouldn't think that the law is something administered by people who are completely unlike them, an elite, narrow group to whom they have traditionally looked up as the leaders of society. They're not going to look up anymore. Deference is no longer with us. They've got to feel that the courts are their courts and are there for them. And they won't feel that if the courts are all very much not like them. So we do have to improve the diversity of the courts. Gender is particularly important because we are, after all, half the human race. And for half the human race not to be properly reflected in the judiciary is a very bad thing. But equally important is racial, ethnic diversity. I do find the Gillen case a very shocking case. I have always found it a shocking case, Matthew. And I hope you feel that in the Roma rights case, we did actually manage to recognize the racial dimension in what was going on and do something about it. So we mustn't think that non-diverse courts don't always get the point. They can sometimes get the point. But the important thing is that people see that they are sufficiently diverse to have a chance that they will get the point. It's the confidence thing that's most important, I would say. But there's loads of other reasons for having diverse courts anyway. Yes. Diverse bodies make better decisions.
Absolutely.
Can I just wanted to say is that actually this divorce between the potential divorce between the judicial system, between the justice system and individuals, is actually potentially heightened by current circumstances and by the remote hearings that we're having. And I think there are dangers there. I don't want to talk about them too much this evening, but I think there are severe dangers. And then we think about the family courts, the way that they're having to deal with matters. And of course, they have to deal with things as best they can, but there is a potential distancing between the parties and the process. And I think we have to be very careful about the use of remote hearings, how that's going to work out over the next few years. But we should be careful about that. We need to be watching that for that very reason. I agree.
Just a couple of quick points, James, if I can.
Yes, and then we must turn to the questions from the audience.
So Matthew, I think your points are great. The sort of deep-rooted underpinning piece that you're pointing to, and pardon me for the superficiality as the comms person, but what's the tweetable version? Sorry, I'll leave you with that thought, but what's the tweetable version as opposed to the lawyer's version? Yeah, I think that's quite, you're in a dogfight on this question. And I think there does need to be at least now a 280 kind of character version. And as I was preparing for today, James, one of my colleagues who's a marvelous, actually a lawyer that's come into my world, pointed me to the case of Alexandra Wilson. I'm sure some of you know Alexandra.
Yes, young woman who had the experience of everybody assuming she's a
precisely, Helena. Yeah, following her on Twitter and looking at that, in September, she rocks up at the courts, and at every single point through the court, there's the expectation that she's not the lawyer. She actually should be in the dock herself. I mean, this is 2020, for goodness sake. And I think it touches on that. So my broad point is, if I can play on these words, you need to widen the bench in every single way.
Well, let me take Ian's point and forewarn the panel. I'm going to try and I'll close out today by asking you for your tweetable version or your short version of how do you make the rule of law real for the ordinary person in the street. Interestingly, the way I was going to phrase that question was in preparation for this session. I've been talking to various people, but I've also been talking to my parents. And I was trying to understand, how do I make this real for my mother? How would she understand that the rule of law is important, to not believe everything that you hear or see or read? So that will be our challenge for the end of this, is how do we make it real for people in a short tweetable sentence? Let me turn, and while people are thinking of that, Ian, given that you posed the question, I'm going to pick on you to come back and let everyone else think while you're answering this question, which is one of the ones from the Slido, which is, how can we depoliticize the debate about lawyers and their role in upholding the rule of law? How do we take politics out of it?
I mean, you know, one could have a very, or should, well, is that possible? As I've sort of my pushback to this. I mean, law and politics, the polity, if you like, more broadly, they kind of come together. You know, in a way, I do hear what Helena was saying. In a way, it's why I've moved towards a written constitution as opposed to someone that wasn't in that place. I do think there needs to be, if we're not going to get to a written constitution, and yes, that, you know, in these times that may be difficult, but something that more explicitly, more with modernity, spells out the boundaries, spells out the roles and responsibilities, allows people to understand, not you must understand, but allows people in to this conversation that we're having this evening. Because at the moment, you know, this is a very, very rarefied conversation that most people wouldn't sit down for at 5:45 on a Friday evening at all. So ways to allow people in, and, you know, when I'm constructing an argument, you know, I don't construct an argument in a court. I construct an argument in the court of public opinion, and therefore that argument needs to be totally accessible. I spend my life, James, getting clients to remove the gobbledygook, to remove the complexity, to strip away the complexity and make things understandable. But no, I don't. I mean, I think it's very, very difficult to remove politics from the law, or law from politics. I don't think that's ever possible, but I don't think at the moment, I think a lot of the profession, because of that supposed politicization, would happily keep its head in the sand. There's not enough people, unlike the people on this Zoom tonight, there's not enough people who are prepared to join in this conversation.
I think there's a point in there about us needing one voice to speak through, that cuts through into the public dimension, that doesn't get lost. There are various different bodies, you know, the Law Society, the Bar Council, and many others who speak, but it doesn't cut through. And I can't help but come back to the Marcus Rashford point that we spoke on earlier on. Does anyone on the panel have a view to who or where that one voice should be, could be, would come from?
I don't think you can have one voice. I think those Marcus Rashford moments happen organically, and to a great extent they happen because there's an issue that arises, and cometh the moment, cometh the person. And so realistically, all I think we can do is try and keep the atmosphere and the culture moving in the right direction, trying to make sure that these debates are constantly in the public domain, that the arguments that we're making, or to use Helena's expression, the stories we're telling, are always being told. I think I really strongly agree with Lady Hale's point about education at the earliest stage, teaching people that the law is part of who we are and what we're about from the very earliest stages. I became a lawyer because at age 10, someone told me Sir Thomas More, was not willing to agree with Henry VIII. Now, the end of the story is he got beheaded, but I was still quite excited by the fact that, you know, someone's power of argument had authority over the king. So I think those little stories that we tell should need to be told and out there. We need politicians who will champion lawyers, who will say the law is important and law is who we are, and the way they did with the NHS. That's what's important.
And there is some comment on the Slido about books that help to teach young people and young children about the law. And reference from Natalie Healy, who's made a comment about Judge Brenda, the book that was published, I think, last year. One of the other questions on there is what would the panel suggest to young lawyers that they can do to bring about a positive impact and make a difference at an early stage in their career?
Well, I mean, listen, it's Pro Bono Week. I mean, let's just give it a shout and remind everybody that that's one of the reasons that we're all here, is because you know, so many lawyers give of their time, do cases where they're not paid. You know, all in my chambers all the time, lawyers are doing that, and it's not just in my chambers, it's in law firms, it's in every set of chambers that people do cases, and it's one of those things that's not really known about law. You can't do them all. I mean, you can't survive if everything you did was for nothing, but people try to do that. But let me tell you, there are too many people who are going without representation where they need representation. They're going without legal advice because, and so you know, the scandal of what's happened to legal aid, which Matthew has so powerfully described, is something that we really have to address. But I want to just say, there's a romance in the description that Matthew gives, and I have this vision of him as a young lawyer going to America, and I did that trip too in my 20s, and seeing how people believed in the American Constitution. Well, it hasn't been that terrific if you watch what's been happening in the last few days and in the last period of judicial appointments and all of that stuff. So, you know, we can romance the idea of how people feel this commitment and belief in something, but they all believe in it in a different way. What I do think is that it's right that after the Second World War, we created things that were really precious and important. And we have to remind people that perhaps law and giving people the access to justice is one of those things, and make that feel powerful to people. I think that when we started adopting the American expression welfare, and we included legal aid in welfare as if it was for the, you know, some unworthy section of the community, which is how welfare has become conceived, you started really interfering with that great notion that we're there for each other, that we should make things possible for each other. So I like the romance of what Matthew has described, but how do we get it to take hold again? And maybe this is a moment where we do it. But I think
that's true. How do we counteract? And David, I can see that you want to jump in, so let me let you jump in, but ask you a question at the same time. How do we counteract the other side of that, though? The romance is right, and we all have I have my own story, and I promised that I wouldn't talk too much as chair, so I'm not going to tell it here, but of why I wanted to go into the law in the first place. On the counter side of that, there are all of these stories and all of these tales from great cases and inspiration. On the counter side of that, there is a tabloid press who will rapidly play to the dog whistle politics, David, that you spoke to earlier on, who will talk about legal aid money being handed to criminals without playing the counterpoint of, well, if people didn't have proper representation, then convictions wouldn't be solid and sound. And it's potential that people would be convicted without actually being guilty of the crime that they're being tried for. So how do we counteract that side of it, which is working opposite these stories that we're trying to tell?
Well, the point I was going to make to Elena's point is, and I think to Matthew's, is that we need champions, and we need champions outside the law to champion the rule of law and to translate it. They may be popular personalities. We talk about Marcus Rashford, but ultimately we need politicians to be champions for the rule of law. And I know there are many politicians who are on both sides of the house, and I think we need to promote that to ensure that they're taking the message out. Dealing with the press is often a difficult thing. I think that I was just reminded, actually, there was a letter, and in fact, I see the Guardian's carrying another letter this morning, but there was a letter from former judges and barristers a couple of weeks ago asking for an apology from the members of the government. Now that was published in the Guardian. I don't know where they had attempted to secure the publication, that is, but to me, that letter should have been published in the Daily Mail or should have been published in the Daily Telegraph, because those, and particularly the Daily Mail with the headlines it has, those are the media that we should be aiming at, and as you say, is tackling in that respect. So I think that we need a little nuance to the way we approach it, but we do need champions to promote the rule of law at this time.
So taking that point, and one last question then from the floor, and then I'll come to each of their panel for their closing tweetable thoughts. To what extent can those champions be anonymous speakers? So an example that one of the questions my audience have put up on the question is, how does the panel feel about someone such as the secret barrister and how they have tried to popularize the rule of law? Is that a good way of going about it? Is that the kind of champion that we're looking for? Or is that, again, the legal profession talking within itself and not breaking outside of its own silo?
Well, I'll take we'll take the secret barrister and the 2 books he's published. I mean, those actually have been hugely popular.
He or she, David?
He or she, yes, I don't know, he or she. Those books have been hugely popular and have raised issues and indeed been read widely by politicians. So I think they are useful. And I don't think that in that particular instance, that's just talking to other lawyers. And I think those messages are important, but they need to come from others as well, and not just lawyers, but others as well making those messages.
Ian, you looked like you were going to jump in on that one as well.
Yeah, I think you need, I mean, secret barrister is great for enlivening the debate, of course it is, but I come back to this point, we need grounded, real life examples. And just picking up on David's earlier point about the difficulty, again, of where we are and this rupture moment. Is this the time for the profession to, throw even more sunlight on what you do, literally, as you have in the Supreme Court setting, to bring the cameras in? Very controversial, I know, that's a hard, we could have another hour and a half on said subject, but practically seeing day to day how law enables life and how it practically sorts out problems. Remove the soap opera of what's written about you in the Daily Mail or anywhere else. David's absolutely right. The comfort zone of the Times and the Guardian, just that. Bring even more transparency and practicality and reality to what you do to the average person.
Thank you, Ian. I'm conscious we have 2 minutes, and I want to let each of the panel give their closing comments. So if you can pick it up in there, but literally kind of maybe 30 seconds each. And Lady Hale, let me start with you.
Oh, I wish you wouldn't do that. Well, never mind. You asked for a tweet, and it's just a thought. Do right to me, and I'll do right to you, and the law will do right to us. That's
Fantastic.
what the law's all about.
That's good.
Setting the bar incredibly high. Would anyone like to choose to go next after that?
Don't mind.
David,
Yeah.
I'll pick on you then.
So my tweet, really picking up some of the themes we've had, is I'm a young single mother. I have 2 young children. I live in accommodation that is damp. The health of my children is suffering. I can't get advice to enforce my rights because I can't get legal aid.
Brilliant.
Thank you. Matthew, let me come to you.
I cannot better Lady Hale's tweet. I really genuinely can't. I thought I could, I absolutely can't. I can't think of a tweet that could do it. I do think that somehow the combination of using every aspect of what we have, social media and everything else, is the right way to make sure the messages are getting out. But I think the last thing I would say on it really is that I'm actually relatively optimistic. We're in dark times in some ways, and populism has run rampant, but I do think that there will come a time when politicians and young people in political movements will say, who we are is the rule of law. That's what we're about, that's who we are. And they will champion that as their political identity and as part of their political ethos. And we will wonder when they are doing it, how we ever got into the mess that we're in now.
I think who we are is the rule of law is probably your tweet.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There we go. Very good. Ian, and I'll come to you, and then I'll come, Helena, come to you last.
No, thank you. And I thank you again for the invitation to this conversation. I think the tweet for me is law enables our society to work. And there's so many underpinning things around that. But like Matthew, I'm kind of hopeful too. Whether or not we've reached peak populism, I don't quite know. But the fact that there are enough people, certainly on this conversation tonight, at 6 o'clock on a Friday evening, who care enough, I just think everybody needs to lean in enough. It's a conversation David and I have often, but I think more and more leaning into this conversation will help you all.
Thank you. Helena, coming to you.
Oh, I said the law is there for you and yours. And if you don't make it yours, the government will make it theirs. And I think that's
very good.
True. If you don't, it really is about holding government to account for me in so much of my kind of work.
Fantastic. All that's left really for me is to thank the panel. We could have continued this conversation, I think, for at least another half an hour or longer, and it would have been incredibly fruitful. It's always difficult to get unpack all of the issues that you would want to in a relatively short amount of time. But thank you so much for the generosity of your time. Lady Hale, Helena Kennedy, Matthew Ryder, David Green and Ian Anderson, we're greatly indebted to you for your time and fantastic and interesting comments. As Mary has just put in the chat, there is a virtual networking session now to close out Pro Bono Week, so please do go and join that. Otherwise, thank you very much to Augusta Ventures for hosting the platform this evening, and to everyone involved in Pro Bono Week. And again, thank you to our panel. Have a good evening, everyone. Make the best out of lockdown part 2. Stay safe and well, and look forward to seeing you all soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.